Hey guys, so welcome to the podcast. It's been a while. So I moved out of my house, lots of stuff, life has happened. And I'm glad to be back. I didn't want to start posting again until I knew I could post consistently. So now hopefully episodes will be coming about every 2 weeks. I've realized I just don't have the capacity to post once a week anymore. I've got a lot more clients for my coaching, so I'm trying to make sure I'm focusing my efforts on doing that to the best of my ability and bringing the highest quality of coaching to those individuals, rather than trying to push podcasts, infographics, studying, work, etc. I'm trying to keep it relatively balanced. But I do just want to say before we start this podcast, this is a very interesting conversation with my friend Jake Remmert. But I do want to say, if you guys are interested in coaching, I do offer a few different types of services. You can find these in the link in the podcast app, in the show notes. Or if you direct message me on Instagram, I can tell you a little bit about the services. But effectively, we have a custom training program, which is definitely guided, so you can still get in contact with me and adjustments are made to the program once a week. That's one of the options. And then there is also your more standard sort of one-on-one coaching, where we can either do it in an email-based or a video-based format. And basically, we check in once a week. You can message me at any time, though, outside of your check-in. And I basically try to make sure that I give the most detailed version of my coaching. So the one-on-one program is really good, but because it is still guided and it's still individualized, but the one-on-one coaching is a little bit more individualized because I get to sort of hear once a week a weekly update of everything that's happened in your life that could be relevant to training and nutrition. So if you are looking to make some muscle gains, lose some fat, make your body composition even better, set some PRs in the gym, get stronger, all that kind of stuff, send me a DM or apply in the link in the show notes. I would love to work with a few more individuals before I start studying my master's this year. So yeah, thank you guys for listening to the podcast, and I hope you enjoy. Hey guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hub podcast. So I'm very glad to finally be back after a little bit of a break. So I'm here with my good friend Jake Remmert. So me and Jake have been talking for probably like over a year now. We've been friends for quite a while now, and this is our first time speaking, which is really, really cool. So I thought I would have Jake on today to discuss a few things. So if you don't know too much about Jake, I'll get him to give a little bit of an introduction about himself. But Jake is a master's student at FAU with Dr. Mike Zordos, who's a very prominent researcher in the space. He's also a powerlifting and bodybuilding coach. So Jake is really, really well informed, and I think that he's one of those people where I can, if I'm skeptical about something that I think is within his wheelhouse, I can go to him and say, "Hey, what do you think?" He's one of those people that I trust quite well. So, Jake, would you be able to give a little introduction to yourself? How did you get into this area of bodybuilding, powerlifting, and like getting tan and going on stage and all those things? Like, how did you get into this?
Dude, it's weird. So I actually didn't even start lifting until I was like 21, 22, something like that. I randomly found it. I was working retail and hated every day of it. And I just randomly found it, and it just consumed me immediately. And that's just all I did in my free time. I was like, I have to make this my job. Right. So then ever since then, I've just been trying to figure that out. Going back to school for it, and now we're here, man. I finished up the undergrad and just moved across the country to do the master's. Yeah. So it's crazy. I just dove in, and here we are, dude. And then as far as like the actual competing and that kind of stuff, I haven't competed in bodybuilding yet because something went and canceled all the shows last year when I was 5 weeks out. But I'm not bitter at all. But yeah, we'll come back 2023 with the team anime and see if we can make it happen then.
Yeah, I cannot wait for that. I'm very excited. So then I know recently you've got into coaching with Data Driven Strength, who's another really prominent group that I'm really good friends with as well. With that, would you describe yourself as like a bodybuilding coach, powerlifting coach? Is it a mixture of both, or what would be your sort of general coaching demographic that you try to sort of focus on?
For the most part, as powerlifters right now, I think something cool about me joining the team is I have more of a bodybuilding background as well. I was just a straight powerlifter for like my first 4 years probably of training. And then I started to kind of blend them a lot more and more and more. And now I'm just bodybuilding. So it's, the progression's been fun and interesting, but, and I'll go back to powerlifting too. I still love it. But a lot of the demographic that comes to us are primarily powerlifters, but very, very interested in getting more and more bodybuilding enthusiasts too, even if they're not interested in competing. We have a couple guys that take hypertrophy very, very seriously. There's been a couple that have teased me with wanting to do a prep here before too long. So we'll see how that goes, man. But it's exciting to think about being able to have both going on for sure.
Yeah, I definitely like the dynamic, and especially with a lot of this like sort of better general understanding in terms of like the community being better informed about like the relationship between hypertrophy and strength. I think it's quite cool, and like the idea that you can do both pretty damn well, I think is really, really cool. Yeah, like I found myself, I've been thinking a lot like, oh, I could do a bench only powerlifting competition. Like, oh, that'd be kind of fun. But
I've seen you, man.
Yeah, we trying. So one of the things that I really liked about your work, you wrote an article on the JPS website a while ago, JPS Health and Fitness, about RIR or RPE. So would you be able to sort of explain, first of all, like what is RIR and RPE, and why do we need it? What is it? What are we using this instead of something else?
Yeah, so to be a little bit more concise, I'll skip a lot of the just general background stuff because it's been around for decades. Originally came from like Borg RPE, that was mostly like a cardiovascular fitness type of thing. That was the 6 to 20 scale that now when we think about that, it's just like what are we supposed to do with that, right? But it's scaled with heart rate for the listeners who don't know. Anyway, then they changed that to a 1 to 10 scale to make it a little bit more intuitive for people. And then 2008, Mike Toucher put out his reactive training manual that sort of tried to adapt that to resistance training in the sense of like a 10 RPE is maximal effort, 9 RPE means 1 rep left in the tank, 8 RPE means 2 reps, and so on. And then Dr. Zordos, the lab that I'm at now, went and validated that scale in research so that we know that it's a valid tool. They did it alongside velocity and percentage. So it's really helpful, man. It's the whole idea of RPE is to try to get some sort of gauge of how close we are to failure. Because obviously, you know, how close we are to failure is important for what kind of adaptations we're getting, right? Funny enough, everything that's been done, we still don't know exactly how close we need to get for the best possible trade-offs between fatigue and gains. It's a technical term, but yeah, dude, it's really just trying to get some sort of gauge that we don't need a velocity tracker or something like that, right? It's just a very easy, just rate the number in your head really quick type of thing.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that when I first found out about RPE, I was like, what like I saw it a few times and I was like, what on earth is this? And then you read into it a little bit more and you're like, this kind of makes pretty damn good sense. Would you be able to sort of go into like, so why would we want to use this scale, and like what is this in comparison to? Like obviously we still have percentage 1RM. Would you say that's still something that's quite viable, or how would we actually utilize that while also trying to use RPE? And like how would you sort of practically apply RPE?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think that now that all the RIR and RPE stuff has kind of come in, everyone's kind of swung even further to where percent 1RM is stupid. Like it's just, I'm like, dude, like there's a time and a place for both, right? I think the reason people think that is because there was some research that came out again from this lab. It was actually 2 studies from 2019 that had people do 70% 1RM on the squat, and they just went to failure. They checked out a couple other things too, but one of the things they were looking at is how many reps could people do with this 70%. And the range in one study was like 6 to 26 reps. And I think the other study was 6 to 25, if I remember correctly, which is crazy, right? So you think just 70%, some people are getting 6 reps, some people are getting 20, 22. So that's why if we just say, let's do 3 sets of 10 at 70%, probably not the best idea, right? Because some people it's going to be perfect. Other people, they're not even going to get a training effect. Other people, they're going to hit failure before they reach that. So what I like to do is I'll say, well, let me back up. What a lot of people have done now is prescribe everything fully with RPE. So they might say we're doing 3 sets of RPE 8 with X load, or you know what I mean, or 3 sets of 10 at an RPE 8, and then the athlete has to just choose the load and adjust. What I like to do personally is I'll say we're doing this many sets, this many reps. I like to use a rep range personally, but because really all you're doing, you have to adjust something as you get tired, right? So whether you have a rep range and you let the reps fall as you get tired, or you're just doing a set number of reps and let the load fall as you get tired, either way, I'm just lazy and I don't want to change the load on the bar. Let me just do different reps. Anyway, but so let's say we're doing this many reps this is the target RPE, but it's probably going to be roughly this percent 1RM. That way they just gives them a starting point, right? And there's research that have found, like, here's the average percent 1RM that's the average person would use for this many reps. So that can be a useful starting point, but everyone's a little bit different, like I said, with that research from last year or the year before last now. So I like to use that table as a starting point. Yeah. And then we just kind of see what happens, right? So if the average person gets X number of reps with 75%, let's say, and then I tell somebody to, like, here's what we're going to start with, and they get 2 more reps than this table says that the average person should get, then I know, okay, moving forward, they're probably going to get more reps than the average person, so that I can kind of adjust. So that's usually how I like to do it. And it just kind of, over time, as you get more and more data, you can kind of dial it in more and more.
Yeah, I definitely have seen the shade thrown at percentage 1RM recently as well. Like it's I guess, but that I think is just human nature in some way. It's like we go one way, we say this RPE is the best, and then it's like we're seeing it in contrast to that, and it's a little bit flawed in some ways.
It's the same with like the clean eating, flexible dieting, like
exactly.
Now we're kind of swinging back, right?
Now it's like tracking is dangerous. We should never do it, and it's like it's just a bit. Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of the swing of information. And I think that's why we need experts to sort of distill this stuff and try and give a reasonable sort of middle ground opinion, which I think is really cool. In terms of percentage 1RM, you mentioned sort of using it to establish a general load that we can start with and go from there. Is there any sort of other uses you're finding of percentage 1RM that you might use later down the track? Because I mean, for me personally, I'm still doing a lot of programming primarily just with RPE. Because I mean, I don't have any clients that are specifically for powerlifting. Everybody's just trying to get jacked. And I haven't found a use case where it's like, okay, for me, that's obviously somewhere where I should prescribe percentage of 1RM. Where do you sort of find that it might play a role outside of like the initial, okay, this might be a good idea for load selection?
Yeah, I think what you kind of alluded to there, that it's probably more important for strength training than it is for hypertrophy. I will say there is some evidence that would suggest that we don't have to get as close to failure as we need to, as long as the loads are heavy enough. And those studies are usually, when it seems to be equivocal or even better results, leaving more reps in the tank. We still don't know exactly how many reps in the tank, which is frustrating, but it is what it is. But we just know short of failure versus failure. As long as it's like 75 to 80% 1RM, that seems to be, you can leave quite a few reps in the tank. It's more than people would think. Some studies, if we look at, there was, how do you even say that name? Lesavicius, something like that. Whoever wants to correct me on that, feel free. That I mean, there was quite a few. I want to say, if I remember correctly, it was like 6 RIR or something like that. That still had the same hypertrophy as going to failure. Wow. So like if the loads are heavy, then sweet, we can save that fatigue, that, if you want to think of it that way, less fatigue cost. But then it's like we kind of have to know what the trick with that is, because we also know from the RIR or RPE accuracy literature that those low RPEs, people are really, really not good at gauging them accurately. So then the percent 1RM can kind of be handy there to say, okay, we know that this is heavy enough. But it's still like, at the end of the day, and I think I wrote this in that article too, that if we just find something in the first week or two that's like relatively difficult, and then you just kind of add a rep or add a little bit of load here and there, like it solves itself, right? And that's something that Mike Rizzuto talks about a lot, and I think it's great. Like it's a self-solving problem, and that can kind of get in there with that too, of that idea of, is this actually heavy enough? Like it will be. You might have to give it a couple weeks, but like even if it was actually a little bit too light to start with, it's going to be fine.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And in terms of progression over a mesocycle, there's been a lot of discussion around many different progression variables over the years. Recently, there's been a lot of debate around set progression. And I think it's one of those things where there's probably multiple ways to skin a cat, even if we're aiming for optimal. So would you be able to sort of outline, like, how do you personally like to, like, and like, there's probably multiple various different ways you'll do it for different situations, but like for your athletes, what sort of progression methods are you generally using over a mesocycle?
That is a can of worms.
Yeah.
It depends where they're at in their training cycle, right? If we're just focused on hypertrophy for the most part right now,
yeah,
usually that's when I'll get a little bit more, I don't want to say aggressive because that sounds really like, but just I'm a little bit more, I'll say aggressive, whatever, just in terms of adding some sets, right? And just trying to figure out what sort of workload is appropriate for this person, right? I mean, we know from all the research, like the Warrenbaum meta from forever ago, all the dose response stuff from Brett Schoenfeld, like if we're somewhere in this 10 to 20 sets per week per muscle group, like that's probably a good place to start, right? But then we still got to kind of, we want to dial it in as much as we can. And I think that's where adding sets really shines, is that we get to work through that range and see what's going on. So I think that in a hypertrophy phase, if we want to call it that, I think that that's the best time to do that. Because if we get a little bit over fatigued, if you will, it's not a huge deal, right? Like it's just our force production capabilities aren't like the main priority at that moment, right? Especially for bodybuilders.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good time to do that. And I usually will do that to try to figure out a good workload that allows them to make progress without just beating them up. If somebody's in more of a strength, typically my mental model is to start with more hypertrophy stuff, run that really as long as we can. There's still like some heavier lifts in there too, right? To work on the technique, the skill, but then we kind of shift gears a little bit more into more strength focused stuff. There's still some hypertrophy in there. It's not like the black and white traditional block periodization. I don't know how deep you've gone down that rabbit hole yet for powerlifting, but it's not so much as a cutoff as just sort of a little bit different focus, just turning the dial a little bit.
Yeah,
is how I like to think of it, like a dimmer switch, right? So then in that phase, I don't like to add as many sets. Like when I do coming out of a deload, I like to start with an intro week that's a little bit lower volume.
Yeah. Just
so we don't get super sore, right? So there's always some sets being added in weeks 2, maybe week 3 as well, just to get up to that reasonable amount. Yeah. But then I like to stay relatively static if we're really focusing on strength performance, just to minimize variables that can cause a lot of muscle damage and all that. If somebody's getting ready for a meet, then I'm real careful with adding sets, because it's like hypertrophy doesn't matter at this point. We're just looking at skill, right? So
because would you be able to sort of elucidate that a little bit? Because I think people, like the difference between powerlifting and bodybuilding training, I find people often misinterpret. And it's like, for instance, when we're aiming for maximal strength performance, it's like, okay, we got to think about what time frame. And we had to sort of think, okay, hypertrophy is obviously a contributor to strength, but it's like, it kind of has to be, what would you call it? Maybe potentiated, maybe might be the right word. Like you have to make that muscle mass able to produce force. And that in general, I would say is maybe likely, would you say that going through a period of time where you're aiming to maximize strength outcomes, like 1 rep max, do you think that might lead to less hypertrophy in the long term?
I don't know. That's tough. That's tough. Because we did just have that study come out that had like a strength phase leading into hypertrophy training, right? I'm not gonna lie. Greg Nuckols talked a lot about the stats in their podcast, and a lot of that stuff, like, I will default to Greg's opinion. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
In terms of just based on experience, I don't know, man. It's like, if we're just focused on hypertrophy, then I don't know. I don't want to say it's a waste of time to go after 1 RM strength just because, like, it's fun, right? And most people want to feel strong too, right? But I have a hard time seeing that there would be no sort of resensitization happening.
Yeah.
Maybe not, right? I could totally be wrong, but it just if we just think about the way that the body tends to work, right? If you don't do something for a while, it's usually kind of sensitive when we go back, you know. So I would be a little bit surprised if that wasn't the case.
Yeah, that's the thing that's really confusing with me, because like you have a lot of people talking about sort of sensitization and desensitization, and it's like it's obviously something we don't really have literature on, and it's like something we probably won't for a while because it's kind of really hard to study. But like it's one of those things where it's like quite curious. Like I find even if you just look at like training in lockdown, like you can get a decent stimulus, but like it's not going to be perfect, obviously. And like then transitioning out of that, it's like even just anecdotally for myself, it's like I was responding really, really well to quite a small amount of volume. And it's like, oh, maybe there is something here. And I would find it hard to believe that there wouldn't be, just by the nature of how the human body works. Like I would find it hard to believe that there isn't some kind of desensitization and resensitization. So I think it's really intriguing stuff there, but I'm not sure how to particularly apply it yet.
I don't know. It's also like how much time do we need to be away from that like meat and potatoes hypertrophy training to get resensitized? Like, is 4 weeks enough, or does it need to be 4 months? You know, like, because if it's 4 months, that's a bummer, right? We're losing a year.
Yeah, like then it's like, is the resensitization even worth it? How long does the resensitization last for? Like, are we desensitized again after a week of training like that, or is it 6 weeks? Like,
there's just so much,
that's
dude.
the thing.
Do you get like a 2% boost, or is it like a 10% boost, or is like there's just so many questions that we just have no idea.
Yeah, that's the thing. Would you say like personally, for instance, in my case, when I have a client where they're sort of, when I think a strength phase or a primer phase or whatever you would like to, however you would like to sort of call it, or however you want to structure it as well, just any phase where you're moving away from traditional hypertrophy training, it's like, I find usually for me, those are best indicated by sort of more mood state markers
100%.
or like more social stuff. Would you say that's sort of the case for you as well? Or like what would be the indicator for you to be like, okay, maybe this athlete who's roughly focused on hypertrophy should maybe go into a different kind of phase?
I completely agree. I think it just like the mood and the motivation, just like burnout, right? Like it's like, dude, I love doing sets 12 as much as the next guy, but like after a while, like give me something heavier or give me something light, just something different, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting. Or like we were just talking about with the sensitivity stuff, like eventually you just don't get as good of pumps anymore. And it's like, well, maybe if I took a few weeks away from this and then went back, even if it's not actually better hypertrophy, the pump feels good. I want to get a good pump, you know, like, so I think just enjoyment, like you said, all the mood, biopsychosocial, see if I can say that without you've mastered that word, man.
Yeah, I mean, we seem to touch on it like every week in podiatry, so yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite nice that we had quite an advanced like understanding of that stuff. Like it wasn't so black and white biological like input output in terms of healthcare. And I'm glad that like people are beginning to think a lot more about this sort of stuff, because it's obvious, like when you start coaching people, it's quite apparent, like, oh, their mood and personality plays much more of a role than like quantitative numbers a lot of the time. Like in some cases, obviously there's some numbers that are very, very useful. One thing that I was actually just thinking of, do you happen to use session RPE, and how do you find it useful, and do you find it's got quite a lot of utility, or do you find it sort of like one of the lesser important markers maybe?
I personally don't pay much attention to it. So when I start with a client, I always tell them like, we can track this if you want to. If you're interested, by all means, and we'll talk about it and we'll look at how it's relating to these other things. But like, I'm not really going to go out of my way to look at it, because like I know how many sets you're doing. I know the RPE of all this stuff. Like I know if this is going to be a hard session or not, right? That being said, there are some people that will surprise me. Like there's this one dude who's got a little bit more of a bodybuilding, I don't want to say full background, but at least more recently before we started like a strength phase, right? So then he'll rate a session RPE that's like so much lower than what some people will do if they're used to just like normal powerlifting. I say normal powerlifting, but lower volume stuff, right? So like there's definitely some differences there. That it's not that it's useless at all. It's just something that I personally don't use a ton. I think that it can be useful. So in powerlifting, it's typically used as a way to kind of judge how like amount of workload, right? And also like average intensity, that kind of stuff. I think it's probably more useful in terms of like set numbers. I think Dr. Zordos wrote a good mass article a few months ago. There was a study about session RPE that came out. The study itself wasn't super useful, but he made a really good argument for using it to think about, should we, if we're going to add sets, maybe looking at session RPE can be useful, which I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Then I don't know, man. I think that I like to, I mean, I love data, right? I mean, it's the name of our company, right? But I also don't want people to stress too much over things that I don't think are super, super important.
Yeah.
Like, let's focus on the stuff that gives me the whatever Pareto principle, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's just, the minimum stuff that can give us the maximum amount of data, let's do that. And then beyond that, it's just conversations. Like, because usually if people feel destroyed, they're going to tell you, you know? So
yeah, like you can almost, I find often you can hear it in their voice. Like you can hear the way they're talking about their week. Like I don't know if you do video or email, but like you find, like it's often you'll see in their expression or how they're moving. And it's like, you can see like, okay, this person is a lot more drained this week compared to last week. Like, is that training or is that other things? But it's like, still definitely you need to take that into account of the picture and like the overall stress that you're going to give them.
Have you messed around with it much?
So yeah, I'm trialing it right now. Like I'm doing it with most of my clients, especially the ones who are sort of like they really easily track their data and it's not really like a stress to them, and they don't feel as though they're getting like questionnaire fatigue or anything.
That makes sense.
I'm also playing around with wellness questionnaires as well, and I'm finding them really, really useful. Like they're
really okay.
Yeah, like the one I do is really basic. It's like 5 questions. I think it's sleep, mood, hunger, 2 other questions. And it's like,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's basically like I just send it to them, not every week, but just whenever I feel as though, 1, either they're really, really well recovered, 2, either if I'm unsure of how they're actually like feeling and doing and recovering, like usually mid mesocycle. And then once I think we're coming to the end of the mesocycle, I send them another one. And then I compare it to the week 1. And that's like, if it was like everything was a 1, and then if everything's a 5, it's like, okay, they've obviously accumulated some sort of fatigue. I'm finding it quite useful, but it's definitely, I'm definitely being not putting too much weight in it too fast. Same with session RPE. Like I'm finding session RPE less useful than the wellness questionnaires at this point. But I definitely think it is showing some merit. But I think I could definitely do a better job of actually explaining it and also understanding it myself.
So I've tried to use it a little bit, just myself, just rating my own sessions. I personally find it difficult because I focus too much on how do I feel right now and what was the last exercise that I did versus thinking about the whole thing. Like I personally just struggle with it. Yeah. Some people probably nail it, right? So it's the same with normal RP.
Yeah, like it's just because I found in my graduate diploma that I just finished at AUT, we talked a decent amount about session RP, but it was more for like soccer or like rugby. And it's like, I guess they don't have the luxury of like having RPE and number of sets done. Like that is just so obvious. Like this is the amount of work that we've done. And as long as RPE is relatively accurate, then that data in general is pretty accurate and it should reflect things pretty well. But then I kind of want to have something on the back end. Like how does the client feel? So I find like the wellness questionnaires seem to work quite well, but yeah, session RPE, I'm definitely still skeptical about it. Another one that's maybe interesting to have a discussion about is volume load. Have you found any like, have you found much utility for that? Because I'm trialing it, and like I've got a little formula that like calculates it, and like I'm trialing it, but I'm very, very skeptical with it. I've had a few discussions with Eric about it, and I'm not really seeing any obvious use case, but it's just such an interesting number. But it's like it's so easily confounded, which to me it seems to be the problem with it, especially in more bodybuilding style training.
Yeah, do some sets of 30 and then I'll jack that
Yeah,
number way up.
like, your volume load would be like 30,000 or something.
Yeah, dude, I think that we use it a little bit with some of the like low fatigue strength stuff that Zach and Josh have talked about ad nauseum at this point. But it can be useful for sort of what I talked about, that kind of model where I like to have more hypertrophy with a little bit of strength, and then more strength, a little bit of hypertrophy. And then if they want to compete, then, you know, I like to do this sort of low fatigue peaking type of style where we found X number of workload in this like strength focused phase. Is this allowed them to make really good progress? They kept them healthy. They didn't get like their hip didn't start hurting, right? Like all this kind of stuff. So I feel really good about this amount of workload. That much got us there, right? And that much allowed us to keep making progress. Traditionally, people will just pull way back, right, in a peaking phase for powerlifting. But it's
you mean like acutely, or like over the 6 weeks, or like the training cessation prior, or
right? So like over, say we're doing a however many weeks long peaking phase, like you said, 6 weeks maybe. Then typically they'll just say like, it's a peaking phase, all right, less sets, right? And it's like, okay, but like like I get what they're doing, right? It's heavier weight, so they're trying to account for that. And it's not like it doesn't work. It works. People have been doing that for forever, right? Like it works great. But maybe we can get a little bit more out of it if we can keep that dose there somehow, right? So weights have to be heavier. There's no way around that, because we're trying to peak, you know, our force production. So we can drop the volume, right, to account for that. Or what we like to do is drop the RPE. So we'll say maybe we were, just as an example, maybe for the squat, they were doing whatever, 3 sets of 6 at, I don't know, 75%, just making up a number.
Yeah.
So then we can say, when we get to this peaking style, maybe like we'll do an intro week that's a little bit less, whatever, but like a meat and potatoes week in the peak, maybe instead of doing 3 sets of 6, we can do 6 sets of 3 with the same load. So our volume load is the same. Does that make sense? So like that's a way that we've been able to use that volume load, and it seems to be useful in that sense. Okay. But that, I mean, that's a relatively small detail. I think that even if it's not the exact same, it's, I mean, you know, just as well as me, nothing is like perfect with this, right?
Yeah,
it's just
100%.
ballpark. Like,
yeah, I find I definitely can see why. I guess I don't get like many powerlifters applying. I don't actually coach any powerlifters for powerlifting at the moment. It's powerlifters for bodybuilding, and which is quite fun. But like, I've said this multiple times. Like, I'm very envious of powerlifters because you can kind of program in a way that's a little bit more numerical. Like, you can be a bit more quantitative, and you can take a little bit more from the numbers. But with hypertrophy, it's kind of like, if you try and use volume load for hypertrophy, I find, I don't know, it's a bit like number of hard sets just seems to make a lot more sense quite like quickly. Yeah. But then like for powerlifting, it's like, it's way less likely to be confounded. Like, you're doing the same lifts every week, like, and they're not like massive rep ranges. And usually it's going for like more often going for a rep target rather than a range. So it's like, I don't know, it seems to make a lot of sense. Like, I've thought a lot about, but it's like using volume load as like a metric for progress, in terms of hypertrophy. And I've been thinking a lot about that, but I don't know if it holds much weight. Like, for instance, maybe on an isolation movement, if like, okay, over 12 weeks, we went from a bicep curl of 12 kilos or whatever the volume load was to 14 kilos of a higher volume load. Like maybe that could be a metric of a good metric of hypertrophy, but it's like obviously we don't have research specifically looking at that I know of. And also it's like, as we know, measuring hypertrophy is like relatively hard and relatively inaccurate depending on how you do it. Like not everyone just has an ultrasound in their house.
Let's get an MRI, dude. You're gonna do it.
Yeah, why don't you? Why not? Like, hey. Yeah, like
that's
it's.
A cool idea, though. I'd be interested if you play with something like that. Let me know how it goes.
Yeah, I'll tell you off air what the whole idea is, and I'm sure someone else is doing it, but I think it's quite cool. And I don't know, it's too like the actual idea is too large for me to just make in my bedroom. Like it's way too. Yeah, there's skills that I don't have that I would need to have to make this occur. But if it did happen, it would be like game changing for like, yeah, it would be pretty sick. But I don't know if it's possible. So one of the things that we've been like discussing a lot in the community recently, and I think it's one of the things that I think deserves a lot more discussion, and I think it's one of those principles that should be talked about a lot more and understood a lot more. Is sort of the balance between reactive and proactive. It's like on one hand, it's like people don't really understand the terminology and get why it's a thing. So would you be able to sort of go into like, why should we even, what is the difference between the two? And also it's like, in what ways would we be programming in a sense that is reactive, and what ways would it be in a proactive way?
Yeah, so I guess to start, proactive, I always think of like planning ahead. I'm just trying to think of a simple way to kind of explain it. So sort of pre-planned would be like proactive things, and then reactive would be based on some sort of feedback that you're getting, whether that's volume load or RPE ratings or whatever, right? Then we would go back and say like, now this happened, okay, now we're going to do this because of that, right? We're reacting to something. So like proactive things that I think make sense would be if you know roughly a certain amount of volume that works for somebody, right? You can plan out like, okay, we're going to hit an intro week first. We're going to work our way up to that, but you can kind of plan that out. And I think that early in a mesocycle, it makes sense to do a lot of things proactively. Giving people ways to make, however you want to do your progressions. If you want to do the double progression, like, or whatever, the dynamic double progression that Brian Miner came up, like that whole thing, or whether you want to do whatever progression method you want to use, right? Some sort of, here's what we're doing, right? And then as time goes on, I think becoming more and more reactive can be helpful.
Yeah.
Especially like making adjustments for the next week. If say you told somebody to do, maybe you're using % 1RM and you see that you thought this set was going to be an RPE 6, but they rated it at an 8.5. It's like, oh, let's drop that back a little bit, right? So stuff like that. Or deloads is usually what people think of, right? I find it useful to softly be proactive with them, if that makes sense. Like, I'm thinking we're going to need one here, but then as we approach it, be a little more reactive. We can always take it early or push it back or whatever. One small caveat for the powerlifters, if there's any powerlifters listening, I might be the only one who cares about it, that if you have a meet coming up, right, then you probably want to say like, we're trying to time it out for the meet. So I like to be a little bit more proactive in that case.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think you like articulated my like anecdotal experience on the issue in quite a good way. Like I've never really thought about, like, I just find myself doing it in that way, like the little bit more proactive towards the earlier end of the mesocycle. Like I literally just finished a client's program where I was like, oh, I am programming sets in a proactive way here, but it seems to make sense. And then as we get towards the end of the mesocycle, it's like more reactive elements seem to come in general. And like, I find it's really, really useful. And I really like the idea of like, I find it's like, it's kind of the thing that differentiates like programming from an actual coach compared to like cookie cutter program you find on, I don't know, some website, and then you download it and you just follow the program. They have the number of sets is prescribed the whole time, and there's no actual changes being made. And I think it's one of the things that I think makes the biggest difference about having someone else actually program for you. Because it's like, the reactive element inherently is kind of the thing that is individualized. But then I think we're in danger in some cases of going too far and saying if it's proactive, it's bad. And then, as we said
That's the thing
earlier,
with this podcast, dude. Just the pendulum.
yeah, like just trying to avoid the pendulum swing in some ways. So I'd like to touch on your article, the article on JPS health and fitness. We sort of touched a little bit on being nihilistic or utilitarian. And one of the things you talked about in this article was the Pareto principle. So would you be able to sort of outline like what is that general idea and why should we think of it in relation to lifting? Like how does this apply to training and nutrition?
Yeah. So I actually got that from a business book, which I think it's a business principle originally. You would probably know that better than me.
What was the book? Do you happen to know?
It was the that's driving me nuts. It was something NBA.
Oh, the personal MBA.
That's what it was. That's what it was.
Yeah, I've read that. It's a good book.
It is good. Basically, it's the idea that like, what is it? 20% of what you do is giving you 80% of the results, right? So, I think that applies to training and nutrition. That like a very small amount of what we're doing is getting most of the work done, right? And then all this little fancy stuff that we can do is just like it's just the little minutia at the top, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the easy example is nutrition because it's like, are you in calorie deficit? Sweet, like,
yeah.
you know, and all the other stuff is just trying to make sure that you can actually adhere to that deficit. And obviously, protein is important and all that, but or like with training, it's, you know, are you lifting heavy? You know, even hypertrophy, it's not even nearly as much. It's easier to lift heavy enough, quote unquote, right?
Yeah.
Are we training hard enough? Cool. That's all you need.
Yeah.
You know? So I just think that we underappreciate that, at least in our community. Once again, like just every little thing that comes out, we're just like, oh, this is it. You have to do this. It's like, I don't know, man. Like you can, and it's cool. Maybe you get a little benefit out of it, but especially if we're talking, if we're talking to coaches, right? Like most people don't either have the time or the energy or the desire to mess with all these little tiny nuances. And I think it can be helpful. It can put their mind at ease, right? Because sometimes they feel like they're missing out or they feel like I can't do X, Y, Z details. So it's not even worth doing. I'm a failure, right? Like, no, dude, like you're fine. So I think that it can just be helpful, particularly talking to that kind of demographic.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct there. Like it's especially that idea of like, oh, I didn't get these three things. And it's like these three things in general will be like a tiny, like less than 10% influence. And then it's like throwing everything out. Like that's when it's kind of like, okay, this is now here's a real inefficiency where it's like actually going to have a massive impact.
That's a very good point. Well said.
Yeah. How would you go about like recognizing or understanding like what are these things that matter? Like if someone's sort of wondering like, hey, what is the 20%? Like where would you point a client in the direction of like helping them understand what actually makes a difference? Because I guess you'll probably always have clients come to you and sort of say things like, oh, don't worry, I'm taking my magnesium or something like that. And like, it's like these things that are just not that crucial, but then you'll see them on the other hand, they'll be like, oh yeah, I overshot calories by about 800 today. Like, I'm sure I'll get them tomorrow. Like I find there's always these things where the understanding of the influence of things can sometimes be out of a line. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Totally. I think that what I usually do is I'll just kind of take a second rather than point them like, hey, go read this or go do whatever. Or you just go read my article. No, but I'll usually just a really quick, like, say I'm giving somebody wants to track their macros or whatever, right? Which not everybody does. Some people just want to do calories or whatever, but say they want to do their macros. And I'll say like, the macros are important, right? Like it matters, but top priority by far is calorie amount, right? Then after that, if you can get your protein in, awesome. Once you get that, if you can get the carbs and fats, sweet. If they need to just kind of be a little off in order for you to still hit your calories, right? That's our top priority, right? So it's sort of giving them a priority list, I think, can be helpful. And it doesn't have to be like a super in-depth conversation, at least in my experience. Usually just like a quick, like priorities, 1, 2, 3, right? And then that's usually enough for people. Training wise, it's usually like, for powerlifters, did you get your squat, bench, deadlift stuff in, right? If they're feeling a little beat up, maybe at least get the movement in. If you have to lower the weight, you have to do less sets, whatever, as long as we get them skill practice in. If it's somebody who's a bodybuilder or they're just about hypertrophy, it's even easier, right? Because all we need is that tension. So we need to lower the weight to get that. I hate to say to get the same stimulus, because how are you measuring the stimulus? But like, just, like if you're usually doing sets at 8 on the leg press, but your hip feels weird, just lower the weight and do a few sets of 20 or whatever. Like it's fine. It's still like you talked about with the hard sets. Like it's more or less the same. Yeah. And you do for a week or two until your hip feels better, and you're good. Yeah. So it's just trying to simplify it as much as possible, right? And then if they got all that stuff and it's easy and they want to look at the details, then let's talk about the details.
Yeah, man, I completely agree. Like I find usually with clients, they'll say, like, I try and be quite like aggressive with saying, you can ask me as many questions as you want. If you have a random question, ask me that. Like I really love when they're like, hey, is this guy talking shit? Is he lying? And I'm like, yeah, no, he's totally on point. This is correct. Or like just being like, oh, this is kind of true, but then this element is not true. Like I really enjoy that element of coaching. I find it quite nice. So I have a random-ish question to finish it off with. Okay. And if you're sort of like, oh, what on earth do I think of this? I can say what I sort of thought of as my my idea of this. So was there like a lesson or piece of info or something that you learned over 2020 that was like, this was the thing that was the biggest deal this year? Like, was there something that just made a lot of sense to you and had a big impact on you as a coach, as a bodybuilder, even as an educator, like anything in that sort of realm?
That is a very interesting question. I think, can I give 2 things?
Yeah.
I think one is it sort of started, that was still 2020. So early in 2020 was still my bodybuilding prep, because I prepped until mid-March before everything got canceled. And I was like, it doesn't make sense to be this lean. But the lesson that I learned from that was submission. And I think that this is how I like to explain it. And I don't know if you've watched Dragon Ball Z yet. I hope you have.
No, I haven't. No.
Bro.
I know.
So, okay. Mild spoiler, but the show's like 30 years old. So, sorry.
Yeah, it's ahead of time.
I always think, the listeners will know. People will know this. I always think of it the first time that Goku turns into a Super Saiyan. He's fighting Frieza, who is like the biggest villain ever at that point, right? And he watches his best friend get killed. Like, his friend was literally screaming for help when he got killed. And he has 3 choices. 1, he can run away. That won't work. 2, just blind rage, fight against it, but he's too weak in his current form, right? He'll die. Or 3, he just submits to that pain and embraces it, and he turns into a Super Saiyan, and then he wins, right? So that's what I got out of prep, is like, you get into this threshold. Me and Ryan, my coach, shout out Ryan Doris, we call it crossing the threshold, where there's this moment where you no longer can fight against it. Like, you're out of energy, right? So all you can do is just submit, just like, man, if I'm gonna die waiting to eat this next meal, then I'm not gonna die. It's fine. And then you just gotta embrace it, and then all of a sudden you can just put one foot in front of the other and keep going. So I think that was a huge one, and I think that has gotten me through the pandemic. Like, moving to Florida, dude, there's just so much that it's like, when you just feel powerless and like you can't do anything, like sometimes it's just you just gotta submit and just like, all right, it is what it is. Just keep walking anyway, And like, second really quick one would be, I've been learning a lot about how your brain works. And my friend Kaylee, who has introduced me to this idea called parts work, that is basically you have a lot of these things in your subconscious that are like different parts of yourself that can come up when certain stimuli are present, that, you know, maybe it's a childhood trauma, or maybe it's a whatever, right, that was not fully resolved, and then that can still affect you. So this applies to what we do. Maybe somebody has some crazy thing from when they were a kid that made them hate how they looked or hate their body, and now they chronically diet, and then, you know what I mean? So like it can really come up in times like this. So I think that learning more and more about that, and just learning that that's important, is something that came up for me in 2020, particularly because of the pandemic has triggered so many things. And just learn, you know, I deal with a lot of issues with anxiety. So learning about this parts work thing has helped me to start trying to kind of figure out, why am I so anxious about sickness and death and things like that, right? So, and again, trying to apply that to what we do as coaches, especially. I think that can be, I mean, obviously they're licensed therapists, like that's their job, right? But just having, it's just like what we talk about, like eating disorders, just having some understanding
100%.
of being able to look for those things and say like, you know, you don't want to overstep your boundaries, of course. But.
Yes. But I think I 100% agree. Like it's 100%, I think, your responsibility, especially if you're in the realm of bodybuilding. It's like, if you don't have an understanding of eating disorders and like the key signs, you're doing your clients a disservice. Like it's definitely 100% an important thing. And I 100% relate to that the sort of idea of like, one, submitting, and also like the idea, like there's this really good chapter in Ryan Holiday's book, Stillness is the Key, where I think it might be titled like Heal Your Inner Child, which is sort of along the lines of like, what have you not dealt with? Like, what are you not actually thinking about? Like, for me, one of the things that I had to really deal with last year, and I sort of thought a lot about it, was like this whole scoliosis thing. Like I've thought about it a lot, but I never really dealt with the idea that like, I know where the key fear is coming from, and it's not entirely irrational, the fear, but it's not 100% like grounded in reality. Like it's in general, it's like this fear of like physical breakdown over time. Like, will I become crippled at X age because of disc degeneration or like any other thing that happens with the scoliosis? And it was really useful for me to like try and tackle that head on in some manner. Obviously last year was kind of a mess, so I didn't get to go to counseling for it, but it's probably something I will do, because it's like, I don't want that weighing on me. Like I'm trying to, you know, live my best life.
Yeah, for sure. And we got to change the narrative around that too, because it's still, people still look at it weird, right? Like it's like, how is that weird? Like that's, it's literally somebody's job to do that, right? And then like you're
like, how is that different from going to a personal trainer? Like
exactly. Exactly. It's the exact same thing.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get my mind more jacked, you know? Like that's all we're trying to do.
What about you, dude?
Yeah. My primary lesson from 2020. Probably like, you can still work a lot and get a lot done while socializing, and like, you can think of yourself, like I often think of myself as like a workaholic, and I think it's problematic thinking of it in that way, because then it's like you can put yourself in this narrative of like, oh, I just work all the time, I don't have time for X, Y, and Z. But it's like, you actually do. What do you like? Did you spend an hour on your phone scrolling Instagram today? Did you spend an hour on Tinder? Like, where did you spend an hour? You know, like, and that's one thing that I really realized. It's like, oh shit, I actually have a lot of time, and like, I'm quite a productive person already. So it's not exactly like I'm wasting hours and hours, but it's like, there is definitely moments where you're like, hey, you look at your to-do list and there's 3 tasks on there that you could complete within 3 minutes. So it's like, what is actually stopping you from doing those tasks? Like I read a really good book called The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield.
One of my very favorite books ever.
Amazing book. Like it's just fantastic. And like this idea of like the resistance is so true. Like for instance, like sending an email where like I'll have send an email on my to-do list. And it's like, that takes 10 seconds. And I'll just procrastinate it for multiple days sometimes. And it's like, stop, like check yourself. And also it's like, I would in the past neglect spending time with friends, or like letting myself at the end of the day, I'd think, okay, no, I could still bash out a little bit more work, or I can sit and hang out with my flatmates for 2 hours. Like I can be completely present with my flatmates and just have a good time, or I can sit and half work for 2 hours. Like really, what is more conducive in the long term to like whatever the goal of life is, happiness or fulfillment, whatever you want to call it. But it's like, what is more likely to actually contribute towards something? I find like I've tried to eliminate a lot of that half work stuff in 2020, but it's still obviously prevalent. But like,
yeah. Can I give you one quick related thing before we wrap up?
Hell yeah.
So about a couple months ago, I went up and stayed at Ryan and his girlfriend's place for a couple days, and they would. Dude, every time that I see him, I swear this dude changes my life every single time.
Yeah. When I told him, I was like, I get what you mean now. Like,
yeah,
he's next level.
Yeah, and he doesn't even get it, which is the weird thing. Like he'll just say something which is just normal, and I'm just like, what? Like,
that's how I feel about Eric. Like,
yeah, dude. And so we were working, right, and then he was like, all right, sweet, you want to go take a walk in this? They have like a wooded area really close to the place. And he still had more work to do. And he was just like, he finds these little pockets where he can just like give me like a quick little like coaching tip or life tip or whatever. And he was like, dude, like there's always going to be more work to do. You can always make another Instagram post. You can always answer this email, always whatever. Yeah. So like get, like priority stuff like clients are top priority. You got to get that done. But like there's always going to be more to do.
100%.
So you have to cut it off at some point or you're going to work yourself into the ground. But then you're trying to do this half work thing that you're talking about, you're never fully recovered either.
Yeah.
So it's the worst of both worlds.
You're not giving yourself permission. Like it's like that's why I found anime so useful, because it's like I'm not gonna work while I'm watching anime. Like I can't watch the anime. Like I'm exactly the only task I'll do is maybe eat. Yeah, exactly, 100%. Like I have to finish Naruto in 2021. If I don't, then like all hell will break loose.
You're a fake fan if you don't watch it all in 1 year.
Exactly. Yeah. 100%.
But it's like that's another thing that he's told me, dude. He's like, I've been working on this thing where, and I'm trying to do it now too. I actually posted about it a while back that like I'm trying to, whatever I'm doing, I'm fully doing that thing. If I'm working, I'm working. If I'm training, I am an athlete. This is the part of that parts work thing coming up too, right? When I'm training, I'm athlete self. When I'm working, I'm coach self, right? Like all these different things. So it's the same thing that you're talking about, right? Trying to like, I can half work for a while, or I can go hang out with my flatmates. I can do whatever. It all ties together, dude. It's crazy.
Yeah, 100%, man. Yeah. Have you read Deep Work by Cal Newport?
I have not. It's on my list though.
Yeah, it's quite good. I read it like years ago, but I definitely want to reread it. This discussion is definitely invigorating me to read it. But yeah. So should we finish up here? That was a really nice way to end the podcast. Very nice. So Jake, where can people find you online? Like if they want to find your content, your articles, your coaching, where can they go?
Probably the easiest place would just be Instagram. It's just jake.datadrivenstrength. On there in the little link tree thing, there's a place to get in for coaching. There's all my articles that are on there, all that kind of stuff, obviously content and whatever, but
boom.
Yeah.
Cool. Sweet.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. I've been listening for a very, very, very long time, since the student side hustle days.